The Veltari Empire had ruled the galaxy for 3,000 years without anyone daring to challenge them. Their black warships moved through space like death itself, and every species they encountered either joined them willingly or got crushed. Beneath their might, 10,000 star systems paid tribute to their power, and their technology was so advanced that most races couldn't even understand how their weapons worked. Supreme Commander Thekmos sat in his command chair aboard the massive dreadnought called Shadow's Edge, reading reports about the latest primitive species his scouts had discovered. He barely looked up from his datapad as he scrolled through information about these new creatures called humans. They had somehow figured out how to travel faster than light, but their ships looked like they were built in someone's backyard workshop. Metal plates welded together, chemical rockets for propulsion, and life support systems that any civilized species would have thrown away centuries ago. The commander almost laughed when he saw images of human vessels. They looked like flying scrap heaps compared to the sleek, crystalline perfection of Veltari warships. These humans had discovered space travel maybe a few decades ago, while his people had been crossing the stars since before most species had even developed written language. It would be like comparing a child's toy to a master craftsman's work. But orders were orders, and the Empire had a simple policy for new species. Either they joined the great machine of galactic civilization under Veltari leadership, or they disappeared entirely. There was no middle ground, no negotiation, no mercy for those who refused to see the obvious benefits of serving their betters. Meanwhile, on the other side of the galaxy, Captain Kim Dae-ho stood on the bridge of the human Warship UES Resilience, staring at the approaching Veltari fleet through the main view screen. The sight made his stomach turn cold. Dozens of alien ships moved toward Earth like a swarm of black insects, each one easily twice the size of his vessel and probably 10 times more powerful. Dae-ho had been a cargo hauler before the war started, running supplies between Earth's colonies and the outer mining stations. He never expected to be commanding humanity's most advanced warship, but then again, nobody had expected aliens to show up demanding Earth's surrender either. The Resilience wasn't even supposed to be a warship originally. It had been a heavy cargo freighter that they'd modified with every piece of alien technology they could get their hands on. His chief engineer, Park Min-seo, had worked day and night for months trying to turn salvaged alien parts into something that might actually hurt the enemy. She'd taken communication arrays from crashed scout ships and turned them into targeting systems. She'd stripped the power cores from destroyed probes and jury-rigged them into the ship's main guns. Every system on the Resilience was a patchwork of human engineering and alien technology that probably shouldn't work together but somehow did. The crew knew they were probably going to die. Everyone on board had volunteered for this mission, knowing it was likely a one-way trip. But they also knew that Earth needed time to prepare its defenses, and every minute they could buy might save millions of lives back home. As the Veltari fleet closed in, Dae-ho received the expected communication. The alien commander's face appeared on his screen, speaking in perfect English that his translation systems had somehow learned in just minutes. The message was simple and had apparently been delivered to thousands of species over the centuries. Surrender now, accept Veltari. Rule and your people would be allowed to serve the Empire. Refuse and your entire species would be wiped out as an example to others. Dae-ho looked around his bridge at his crew. These people had families back on Earth, dreams and hopes for the future, lives they wanted to return to. But they also understood that some things were worth fighting for, even when the fight seemed impossible to win. Instead of responding to the surrender demand, Dae-ho gave an order that surprised even his own crew. He told Min-seo to route all remaining power to the engines and prepare for ramming speed. The Resilience might not be able to win a traditional space battle, but it could definitely make the aliens remember this day. The human ship charged straight at the Veltari flagship, taking massive damage from enemy weapons but refusing to change course. When the two vessels collided, the explosion lit up space for thousands of kilometers in every direction. The explosion from the collision should have destroyed both ships completely, but somehow the Resilience survived. Not in any way that made sense to the Veltari, though. The human vessel was trailing a stream of atmosphere, debris, and what looked like half its internal structure. Yet it was still moving and still fighting. Commander Thekmos stood frozen, on his bridge, watching something that violated every rule of space combat he'd learned in 3 centuries of military service. The human ship was literally falling apart in front of his eyes. But instead of trying to escape or sending out distress signals, it was actively hunting his escort vessels like a wounded predator that had decided to take as many enemies down with it as possible. What happened next would be studied in military academies across the galaxy for generations to come, though nobody would ever quite believe the reports. The humans had somehow turned their ship's life support system into a weapon. They were venting their own breathing air in controlled bursts, using the pressure differential to create improvised thrust that let them change direction in ways that their damaged engines couldn't manage alone. But that wasn't the strangest part. The strangest part was that they were also using their escaping atmosphere as a delivery system for some kind of chemical weapon they'd cobbled together from their own medical supplies and cleaning products. 2 Veltari escort ships got caught in these clouds of vented air and immediately lost power as their crystal-based computer systems started shutting down from contamination. Lieutenant Li So-young sat at her tactical station aboard the Resilience, blood running down her face from a head wound, coordinating their impossible retreat with the same calm precision she might have used to plan a grocery shopping trip. Her console was cracked and sparking. Half her displays were dead, and she could hear the ship's hull groaning and creaking around her like it might split apart at any second. But So-young had grown up in the asteroid mining colonies, where failure meant death, and thinking fast was the difference between coming home with a full cargo hold or not coming home at all. She'd learned to look at broken systems and see possibilities instead of problems, to take things that weren't working properly and make them work in completely different ways. While the Veltari were trying to figure out what had just happened to their escorts, So-young was already planning their next move. Her analysis of the situation was brutally simple. The Resilience couldn't win a fair fight against even one Veltari warship, let alone an entire fleet. Their weapons were underpowered, their shields were failing, and their hull was compromised in at least 30 different places. But So-young had realized something that the aliens hadn't figured out yet. The humans didn't need to win a fair fight, because they weren't planning to fight fair. They were planning to fight like their lives depended on it, which they did, and like they had absolutely nothing left to lose, which they didn't. The Resilience limped away from the battle zone, heading toward the asteroid field that surrounded the outer edges of the solar system. To the Veltari, it looked like the humans were running away to die somewhere quiet. But So-young knew that asteroid field better than she knew her own apartment back on Earth. She'd spent 5 years working the mining platforms out there, learning every rock, every abandoned station, every hidden pocket of ore and ice that the big corporate ships had missed. As they disappeared into the maze of floating rocks and derelict mining equipment, So-young began putting together a plan that would have been considered completely insane by any rational military strategist. She wasn't thinking like a naval officer, trying to preserve her ship and crew for future battles. She was thinking like a cornered animal that had decided to make its hunters pay as high a price as possible for their victory. The Veltari had fought thousands of species over their long history of conquest, but they'd always fought civilized opponents who followed predictable patterns of behavior. They fought for territory, for resources, for political advantage, or for honor. When they were clearly outmatched, they surrendered. When their ships were damaged beyond repair, they retreated. When their cause was hopeless, they accepted defeat. With dignity, the humans, So-young realized, were about to teach them what it meant to fight an uncivilized opponent who didn't care about any of those things. They were going to show the galaxy what happened when you cornered a species that would rather die than kneel, and that knew how to turn their own deaths into weapons against their enemies. 3 months after the first battle, the Resilience had become something that didn't appear on any of the Veltari star charts. It wasn't quite a warship anymore, and it definitely wasn't the cargo hauler it had started as. The vessel had transformed into something entirely new, a hybrid of human desperation and alien technology that seemed to exist in the spaces between what should be possible. Chief Petty Officer Choi Jun-ho had always been good with his hands, but the past few months had turned him into something approaching a mad scientist. The ship's cargo bay, which used to hold containers of food and medical supplies, now looked like the workshop of someone who had completely lost touch with reality. Workbenches made from torn-out bulkheads held partially disassembled Veltari weapon systems. Cables and wires ran everywhere, connecting devices that had never been designed to work together. Jun-Ho had learned to read alien technology the way other people read books. Every piece of salvage they recovered from their attacks became a puzzle for him to solve. He'd take a Veltari communication array and figure out how to turn it into a targeting computer. He'd strip the power cells from their emergency beacons and wire them into improvised explosive devices. Most importantly, he'd learned to think like the aliens, to understand not just how their technology worked, but why they'd built it that way. The breakthrough had come when he realized that Veltari systems were designed for efficiency and elegance, built by a species that valued perfection over adaptability. Human technology, on the other hand, was designed by people who expected things to break and needed to fix them with whatever was available. When Jun-Ho started combining the two approaches, the results were weapons that the Veltari couldn't predict or counter. The crew of the Resilience had learned to live like space pirates, but pirates with a very specific target in mind. They knew every abandoned mining platform in the asteroid belt, every derelict station that had been left behind when the big corporations moved on to richer fields. More importantly, they knew how to make those dead installations look like accidents, waiting to happen. Lieutenant Lee So-young had developed a system for their attacks that was as elegant as it was terrifying. The Resilience would hide near an abandoned mining station, looking like just another piece of space junk floating in the asteroid field. When a Veltari patrol came close enough, they'd trigger what looked like an industrial accident. Maybe an old fusion reactor would overload, or a cargo container full of mining explosives would detonate, or a massive piece of mining equipment would break free from its moorings and go spinning through space. The Veltari would move in to investigate, thinking they were dealing with the normal hazards of operating in an old industrial zone. That's when the Resilience would strike, using the confusion and debris from the fake accident as cover for their attack. By the time the aliens realized what was happening, half their ships would be disabled, and the human vessel would be disappearing. Back into the maze of rocks and metal, Supreme Commander Thekmos had personally taken command of the hunt after the third successful ambush. This was no longer just about conquering a primitive species. This had become a matter of imperial honor, and more importantly, a test of everything the Veltari thought they knew about warfare. But Thekmos was discovering that everything he'd learned in 3 centuries of military service was useless against an enemy that refused to play by the rules. The humans didn't want to capture territory or destroy specific targets. They didn't seem to care about casualties or strategic advantage. They just wanted to hurt the Veltari as much as possible before they died, and that made them impossible to predict or counter. Traditional military doctrine said that you could defeat any enemy by understanding their goals and then preventing them from achieving those goals. But how do you fight an enemy whose only goal is to make you pay for attacking them? How do you negotiate with people who have already accepted that they're going to die and just want to take as many of you with them as possible? The Veltari had protocols for dealing with desperate enemies, but those protocols assumed that the enemy would eventually become rational when faced with overwhelming force. The humans seemed to become more dangerous the more hopeless their situation became. Every attack by the Imperial fleet just made them angrier and more creative in their responses. Worse, word was starting to spread throughout the galaxy about the species that was somehow holding off the mighty Veltari Empire. With a single damaged ship and a crew of barely 200 people, other subjugated races were beginning to whisper among themselves, wondering if maybe the Empire wasn't as invincible as everyone had believed. Communications officer Han Yu-jin had always been good at listening to things she wasn't supposed to hear. Before the war, she'd worked for a shipping company where knowing which trade routes were getting hit by pirates could mean the difference between profit and bankruptcy. Now sitting at her jury-rigged console aboard the Resilience, she was using those same skills to eavesdrop on the entire Veltari Empire. The aliens thought their communications were secure, but Jun-Ho had managed to crack their encryption using a combination of salvaged equipment and pure human stubbornness. What Yujin was hearing in those intercepted messages was making her hand shake as she typed up her reports for Captain Kim Dae-ho. The Veltari weren't just angry about one human ship causing them trouble. They were terrified. Their military commanders were sending increasingly frantic messages back to their homeworld, trying to explain how a species that had barely figured out space travel was somehow outfighting their most experienced battle groups. But more importantly, they were worried about something that went far beyond one stubborn human crew. Word was spreading throughout the galaxy about the humans who refused to surrender. On mining worlds where alien slaves worked 16-hour shifts, extracting resources for the Empire, workers were whispering about the species that had somehow hurt the invincible Veltari. In research facilities where captive scientists were forced to develop new weapons for their conquerors, people were quietly discussing the tactical innovations that were keeping one damaged ship alive against impossible odds. Yujin realized that what they were doing aboard the Resilience had stopped being just about Earth's survival. Without meaning to, they'd become a symbol for every oppressed species in the galaxy. They were proof that the Empire could be hurt, that the mighty Veltari weren't as unstoppable as everyone believed. The intercepted communications painted a picture that would have been funny if it weren't so deadly serious. Veltari military officers were arguing with each other about human tactics, trying to understand how creatures they considered barely civilized were consistently outmaneuvering their fleets. Some were demanding reinforcements, others were suggesting they should just destroy the entire solar system and move on to easier targets. But Supreme Commander Thekmos had made this personal. Yujin could hear the frustration and growing desperation in his coded messages to the Imperial High Command. He wasn't just dealing with a military problem anymore. He was facing the possibility that 3,000 years of Veltari supremacy might be built on a foundation that was far more fragile than anyone had realized. The breakthrough moment came when Yujin intercepted a message from the Veltari intelligence service. They discovered that several subjugated species were secretly studying human tactics, trying to reverse engineer the techniques that were keeping the Resilience alive. Some were even attempting to modify their own equipment, using principles they'd learned from observing the human ship's improvised weapon systems. When she brought this information to Captain Kim Dae-ho, Yujin watched as the full implications hit him like a physical blow. They weren't just fighting for Earth anymore. They'd accidentally started teaching the entire galaxy how to resist the Empire, and that made them infinitely more dangerous to the Veltari than any conventional military threat. The end came faster than anyone expected. The Veltari had finally managed to corner the Resilience in a dying star system at the edge of their territory, using overwhelming numbers and superior positioning to cut off every possible escape route. The human ship was battered beyond repair, held together by emergency patches and the stubborn refusal of its crew to give up. As the Veltari fleet closed in for the final kill, Captain Kim Dae-ho made a decision that would echo across the galaxy for generations to come. Instead of trying to fight his way out or negotiating for the lives of his crew, he ordered Yujin to open a transmission on every frequency her equipment could reach. What followed was 5 minutes of compressed data that contained everything the humans had learned about fighting the Veltari. Technical specifications for turning civilian equipment into weapons, tactical analyses of Imperial fleet movements and defensive weaknesses. Most importantly, detailed instructions for the psychological warfare techniques that had proven most effective against an enemy that had never faced real resistance. The message went out simultaneously to thousands of worlds across the galaxy. Every oppressed species, every enslaved colony, every forgotten outpost received the same information. They learned how to turn mining equipment into mass drivers, how to use industrial accidents as cover for military operations, and how to think like scavengers who could make weapons out of whatever materials were available. But more than the technical details, they learned something far more valuable. They learned that the Empire could be hurt, that their oppressors weren't gods, but just another species with weaknesses that could be exploited. They learned that sometimes the most dangerous enemy isn't the one with the biggest guns, but the one with nothing left to lose and the creativity to use that desperation as a weapon. The rebellion didn't start with massive battles or grand declarations of war. It began with small acts of sabotage that the Veltari barely noticed at first. A mining platform would suffer a convenient equipment failure, a supply convoy would get lost in an asteroid field, a communication relay would mysteriously stop, working just when it was needed most. But within weeks, those isolated incidents had grown into something that made the Empire's leadership realize they were facing their worst nightmare. 50 different worlds, scattered across the galaxy, had simultaneously begun using the tactics that one human ship had broadcast to the universe. The oppressed species hadn't just received the technical specifications for improvised weapons. They'd learned to think like humans, to see opportunity where others saw only desperation. Navigation specialist Yun Hana had survived the destruction of the Resilience, along with about 30 other crew members who'd managed to escape in the ship's emergency pods before the final battle. She'd been found floating in space by a rescue ship, crewed by aliens who had never seen a human before, but knew exactly who she was. Her name had become legendary across the galaxy as one of the people who had taught the universe how to fight back. Now 6 months later, Hana found herself commanding something that shouldn't have existed according to every military textbook ever written. Her fleet was a collection of cargo ships, mining vessels, converted passenger liners, and salvaged military craft that had been cobbled together by a dozen different species who had never worked together before. They didn't have matching uniforms, standardized equipment, or even a common language. What they had was something far more dangerous, a shared understanding of what it meant to fight like you had nothing left to lose. The ship Hana commanded wasn't the original Resilience, which had been destroyed in that final battle against Supreme Commander Thekmos. This was the Resilience II, built from the wreckage of a Veltari heavy cruiser and modified using techniques that combined human engineering with alien technology. Like its predecessor, it looked like it should fall apart at any moment, but it had already survived 3 major battles and was somehow getting more dangerous with each engagement. The assault on the Veltari homeworld began with a strategy that would have been considered impossible just a year earlier. Instead of trying to fight through the Empire's defensive fleets in a conventional battle, the rebel forces used the same tactics that had made the original Resilience so effective. They came at the planet from 50 different directions at once, using small groups of ships that attacked like swarms of angry insects rather than organized military formations. Each group was led by survivors from the original human crew, people who had learned to think tactically during those months of guerrilla warfare in Earth's asteroid belt. But the bulk of each force consisted of aliens who had spent their entire lives serving the Empire, who knew its weaknesses and blind spots better than any human ever could. The Veltari had prepared for a conventional invasion with massive defensive platforms and organized fleet formations designed to repel traditional military attacks. What they got instead was chaos. Converted mining ships used their industrial equipment to tear through the outer defensive perimeter. Passenger liners loaded with improvised explosives rammed into military installations. Cargo vessels that looked harmless until the last second opened up with weapons that had been built from salvaged parts and human ingenuity. Supreme Commander Thekmos watched the destruction from the bridge of his flagship, trying to coordinate a defense against an attack that violated every principle of military strategy he'd ever learned. The rebels weren't trying to capture territory or secure strategic positions. They were simply trying to cause as much damage as possible, and they were succeeding beyond his worst nightmares. But as the battle raged around the Veltari homeworld, Thekmos began to understand something that chilled him more than the sight of his burning fleet. The humans and their allies weren't fighting to conquer the Empire. They weren't trying to replace Veltari rule with their own domination. They were fighting to tear down the entire system that had kept the galaxy locked in 3,000 years of oppression. The final moment came when the Resilience II, battered and trailing debris but still fighting, broke through the last line of planetary defenses. Hana could have destroyed the Veltari capital city with the weapons at her disposal, could have ended the war with a single devastating attack. Instead, she broadcast a simple message to every ship in the system, both rebel and imperial. The war was over, she announced, and it was time to start building something better. The age of empires ruling through fear and superior technology was ending. In its place would come an era where innovation mattered more than tradition, where cooperation was valued over domination, and where even the smallest species could stand up to the mightiest empire if they had the courage to try.